Hi, I'm Josh Tsui, and I'm the director of Insert Coin.
Midway is the punk rock, they're like the Ramones or the Sex Pistols of the video game industry.
If their game became very successful, you were going to make a lot of money.
Keeps on fire! I'd buy that for $1.
I always thought with video games, when you make them, somebody would come with this book. This is what we're going to make, and we start page 1 and we start making it. It was never like that. It was like, so what do you guys want to do?
The games are louder, the graphics are more detailed.
More blood, more blood.
Toasty! What game does that?
They've got this game, Mortal Kombat, and you can kill people.
Yeah, isn't that really cool?
What the hell?
We can do whatever we want.
We wanted to crush the player.
We want to give them a greater challenge.
Hasta la vista, baby.
This is probably the greatest story of Midway.
I call it like the Big Bang of the video game universe. I mean, we went from blank screens to all of a sudden, no one had seen anything like that in the video game.
We went to the well too many times.
And that was the end of Coin.
We're going to sue the crap out of them.
I don't think it hit me till decades later that my image is still in there. I have daughters now. They're going to see this.
Sometimes I'd sneak up behind him. Guy would take a shot and I go, ugly shot! Boom shakalaka! He'd turn around and go, hey, you sound like the guy. I am the guy, dude.
I remember thinking to myself, wow, I'm working with gods.
Mortal Kombat!
Narc. T2.
The Grid.
You know what a game is? A game is 100 of those cool things, and now you have one.
We've got the godfather, the doctor of video games. What do you call yourself?
Face.
A wrap.
That's good, that's a wrap.
That is the trailer for the soon-to-be-released documentary, Insert Coin. And this is Factual America. Factual America is produced by Alamo Pictures, a production company specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for an international audience. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood, and every week we look at America through the lens of documentary filmmaking by interviewing filmmakers and experts on the American experience. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures to be the first to hear about new productions, to find out where you can see our films, and to connect with our team. For those of us who grew up in the 1980s and 90s, the arcade was a home away from home. And most likely we were playing a video game that was the creative genius of a scrappy group of renegade designers in Chicago. In his film Insert Coin, director Josh Tsui captures what it was like for the fellas at Midway Games to revolutionize the video game industry. And along the way, Josh perfectly captures 1990s pop culture. We catch up with Josh from his home in Chicago. Josh Tsui, welcome to Factual America. Josh, how are things there in Chicago?
It's great, thanks. Well, I mean, as great as can be under the circumstances.
Yeah.
But, Chicago's a great town, and so if I'm going to be sheltered in place, I can't think of a better city.
It's have things settled down there any time recently, or is it still kind of as it was a few months ago when the peak of the virus?
It had gotten better, and the city started opening up again, but just recently it started to things started to rise a little bit. So there are some concerns that there's a chance we might kind of take a step back. So it's okay. We get everything delivered, and we're not suffering that badly. So I can't really complain.
Yeah, it's exactly. I think of the people who actually are suffering. No, I can't complain whatsoever. We were supposed to meet up at South by Southwest, I think. And maybe we'll talk more about that later. But it's good to finally meet you and get you on the podcast. The film is Insert Coin 2020. Now, Josh, where can we see this film?
So right now it's currently winding its way around the quote unquote film festival circuit. I like And it was supposed to world premiere at South by Southwest, but as we know, the entire world shut down, and so a lot of plans have changed. But since then, the film has been accepted in quite a few other film festivals, and so a lot of them have been going online instead of being physical film festivals. So just recently had its Australian premiere at the Melbourne Documentary Film Festival, and there are a few other film festivals that are coming up that haven't announced their lineup yet. So I can't say which ones they are currently, but there's another 4 or 5 festivals as we're going along here.
That's great. I mean, it's maybe something we can talk about later as well. I mean, you're the second one we've had in the last 3 of these recordings that's had a premiere at the Melbourne Film Festival. So, so well done. I know these are not the easiest of times as we all try to figure out how this is all going to play out now and in the future. But I imagine once you've been through these festivals, I mean, I'm sure you're going to get picked up quickly, because this was, if I may say, one of the most entertaining times I've had watching a film. I highly recommend it to everyone once it finally comes out, because it's so, well, I think we're going to talk also about your background, because I think it comes through in terms of how tight and entertaining this is in terms of the story. But people have heard or watched the clip, which is part of our intro. But maybe you can, for those, well, most of our listeners will not have heard or seen the film unless they were at the film festival circuit. Maybe give us a little synopsis of what this film's about.
Absolutely. Yeah, the story is about a company called Midway Games that was previously called Williams Electronics back in the 80s and became Midway in the 90s. And they were known for their incredibly bold and brash and, for the most part, violent video games for the arcades of that era. And they really made a name for themselves with these games that just really broke all the rules. And so, as many people may or may not know, there was a big video game crash in the 80s. And so when the 90s came around, video games had to change. And a lot of the changes were these things that Midway's game developers were creating. And so I wanted to make a documentary about that company in that era and how they changed games forever after that. And just, with their, we call it the punk rock attitude of game development.
Yeah, I think you capture that extremely well. I mean, maybe for our listeners as well, because a lot of people will not even appreciate. In fact, I lived through this era. I didn't know about the 80s crash, but set the stage. What was it like pre-Midway Games? I mean, what were arcades like, the games themselves?
Yeah, so in the first heyday of video games, especially arcade games, there were games like Pac-Man and Donkey Kong and a lot of really fun, family-friendly games, very colorful. And back then, everybody was a gamer. You go to an arcade and you see families out there, you see little kids, you see the parents playing with them, and they're all very fun, abstract type of games. And that's when the medium was really starting to develop. By the time you got to the mid to late 80s, there were so many video games out there that people just got tired of video games. And especially if you look at when games came home with systems like the Atari 2600, there's very little quality control. Everybody wanted to make a quick buck and basically ruin the industry. And that's what kind of led into this rebirth in the 90s. It was basically video games died so badly that there was nowhere to go but up and restart the entire medium all over again. And so that's what the 90s represented.
Okay. And then that takes us to a fella named Eugene Jarvis, a sort of voice in the wilderness. Now, if maybe still is in some ways. So he'd been active in the 80s, right? I mean, he's got some big name games, at least from my era, Defender, Robotron, but
yeah, he was huge. He was basically the Steve Jobs of video games in the 80s. He single-handedly, he made a game called Defender that game single-handedly made just hundreds of millions of dollars for what was back then called Williams Electronics. And so he made hit game after hit game and was just a psychotic genius, for lack of a better way of explaining it. And And as we get into the 90s, he basically, we called him the godfather of video games because he just left such an impression on an entire generation of developers, that grew up in the 90s.
And so he, I gather he left for a little bit, tried to go back to school or something, but then is lured back to Williams.
Yes.
And so the next, you then focus on a game called Narc. Now,
yeah.
So that was actually late 80s, wasn't it?
That was the very, very late 80s. And so, so Eugene, after when the crash happened in the late 80s, like mid to late 80s, Eugene decided that he just didn't want to do video games anymore. He went off to grad school and back in California. And, he, after grad school, he felt the pull of video games. And, that's one of the deep, dark secrets of game developers is once you make a game, you can't get it out of your system. It's one of the most fulfilling and frustrating creative mediums out there, and you get it. It's intoxicating. And so he had to come back, and he came back to Williams. And Williams at that time was, their pinball division was doing pretty well, but they had almost no video games going on. And he wanted to come back and do one more video game, and he wanted to do it for Williams. And he pitched this game called Narc that was influenced by what was back then the late 80s violent movie streak that was going on. You're talking about movies like RoboCop and and The Exterminator and all these things. And Hollywood was all about the ultra violent movies. And so he wanted to make a video game that was basically the video game equivalent of these action films. And so he went in and he wanted to basically make an interactive movie using actual actors instead of cartoon characters.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk a little bit more about that, but I think this takes us a good point to watch or listen to a clip that you've gracefully shared with us. Thank you so much about Narc. And it's about a minute and a half long. And so let's listen to that now. So that clip talks about Narc and the violence, but I think you just before going into that, you talked about, this is what was really cutting edge, wasn't it? This whole use of live action, digitizing actual individuals.
Yeah, that was something that a couple of companies have dabbled in it, a little bit here and there, but they were just executed very badly. And so Eugene really wanted to use real actors for two reasons. One, he just, he wanted to get that Hollywood feel to it, a Hollywood action movie feel to it. But the other one is really for economics. And it's, back in the late 80s or so in Japan, there, some of the best arcade games came from Japan, and they had huge teams of people working on animation, just making incredible art. Williams Electronics and even Midway after that was known to be very frugal, very cheap, very just kind of, down and dirty. And so there was never, enough money to bring in, a team of artisans. And so he thought to himself, you know what, if we can, instead of having a bunch of animators making art that's very expensive, why don't we just bring in people, put them on tape, digitize, the images frame by frame and get them into the game and see how that looks. And that, that technology that they built there basically kickstarted everything that Midway did in the 90s after that.
Yeah, I think, so basically this leads to a video game revolution, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, because some people were looking at Narc and thinking like, wow, this looks like a movie. And, it seems kind of silly to look at it now because they're very low resolution sprites running around. But back then, it was revolutionary and people really went nuts over it. And, you couple that with just the sheer violence of the game itself, and, and it was just a whole new world was born, and that set the tone for Midway.
Yeah, and then so Williams and Midway were right at the center of all this, weren't they?
Yeah, they took advantage of it. They took advantage of the controversy of Narc and really wanted to run with it. And they just thought, wow, this is, looks like this is what the consumers want at this point. So let's dive in.
I think you captured, I just noticed it. It's sort of subtle, but at the end of one of the games in Narc, the sort of FBI little, public address sort of public service announcement comes up saying, the war on drugs and everything. But so they follow. I mean, it just goes from better to even better. I mean, it's Mortal Kombat's next, isn't that?
Yeah.
Right?
So there are a couple of games in between as they're tweaking the technology and improving upon it. But like one of the key games before that was Terminator 2, and they really furthered the look of the game. But then, Mortal Kombat comes around, and that was originally supposed to be a very small project that a couple of guys wanted to try out because there was another game was delayed, and so because we're making arcade games, there's a whole assembly line that's there, and so if a game is late or ends up getting canceled, something has to go in there. Otherwise, a lot of people working the assembly lines are going to get laid off. And so Mortal Kombat was just supposed to be a small 6-month game. Let's just put it together. And two guys, John Tobias and Ed Boon, came up with this idea of, well, you know what, Street Fighter 2 is doing fantastic. People love fighting games. Why don't we try this digitizing technique on a fighting game? And by that point, after Narc and Terminator 2, the process was a little bit more perfected, and really Mortal Kombat is a culmination of how good that process became, because it just blew people's minds away. Just big characters on screen that look completely realistic, incredible background that were a combination of hand-drawn art and photographs, and it just all came together.
Yeah, and they were supposed to originally have Jean-Claude Van Damme on it, weren't they? Or they were just trying, wasn't it?
Yeah, Jean-Claude Van Damme, as people may or may not know, was a huge star at the time. Yeah. And so they, after Terminator 2, Midway got very excited about licensing IP. And so they wanted to hit up Jean-Claude Van Damme, and they actually signed him up to be in the game. But at that point, he was at the height of his stardom. He was just, from what I've been told, was just a real jerk about things, very uncooperative. Yeah. And again, for a scrappy little Chicago company, it's just, hey, it's all about the work. We don't need this. Let's just, and this is for a small project. Let's just move on. And so they ended up creating their own characters, which was, if you look back on it now, it's just amazing, because that's, it's $1 billion franchise that's still going on now. And it's because Jean-Claude Van Damme was just being a jerk.
Yeah, exactly. And you got you've still got some of the actors that they brought in for the live action. The guy who played Johnny Cage. I recognized him immediately, actually.
Wow.
I didn't really even play the game, but I was like, wait a minute, that it's amazing. I mean, I guess you had to track down all these people. And
yeah, it was I was very fortunate that I knew a lot of these people who made the games and starred them and everything, and they, the majority of them all still live in Chicago. For some reason, people who live in Chicago never leave the town, and so it was very easy to get most of them. And 20 years have passed, so they were just very excited to be talking about the work that they did.
Yeah, I think that's if you don't mind, let's we've got a good clip here. We had a few Mortal Kombat clips, but this is one titled Mortal Kombat Fatalities. And I think it kind of gives a little, for those who don't know or don't remember or have decided not to remember, this is what, this gives you a little insight into what Mortal Kombat was all about, especially when it got started out in the early 90s. First of all, that's another great clip from the film. I think the things also went in a slightly different direction. It wasn't all violence. And very soon they followed that up with NBA Jam, didn't they?
Yeah, NBA Jam was, as big as Mortal Kombat was at the time. A lot of people forget that NBA Jam was just as big, if not bigger. It was definitely, a lot of people don't realize that game by itself in its first year grossed $1 billion. And this is the same year that Jurassic Park came out, and it made 3 times the amount that Jurassic Park made. And
all in quarters is one of your...
All in quarters, that's the thing, a quarter at a time. And that game is an example of how in the arcade games made a lot of money in the 80s, but in the 90s, a game like NBA Jam really showed how designers were able to master the art of a fun game that monetizes extremely well. And one of the quotes from the film is that the designers were tasked to make a game that will suck in a quarter every 45 seconds, and NBA Jam did that. Did more than that every 45 seconds, and it was a combination of just it had to be fun ultimately, but can you make a game fun and in some ways manipulate people to keep putting in quarters because it's so fun.
Okay, so I think that brings us to a really another great clip that looks at NBA Jam and the success they had, and how initially they were a little concerned because they were getting reports that the game was actually breaking down. We'll go to the clip, and we'll also take a little break for our listeners at home. You're listening to Factual America. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at Alamo Pictures to keep up to date with new releases or upcoming shows. Check out the show notes to learn more about the program, our guests, and the team behind the production. Now back to Factual America. Back to Factual America. I'm with Josh Tsui, director, writer, and producer of Insert Coin. So, Josh, you're talking about it become at least video game arcade games have become $1 billion industry. Let's cut to the chase, because I think, hopefully our listeners will get to see this film relatively soon. So don't want to just give away the whole film, but you were sort of alluding to this business model, and I think you even called that segment in your film Homecoming. But basically, tell us what was the downfall for Williams and Midway specifically, but for the industry in general.
Well, I mean, so with the industry, with the arcade industry, it was about people coming, leaving their house, coming to an arcade, sinking in quarters to keep playing on. And for a while, that was fine because that was really kind of I wouldn't say the only option, but it was the best option for video games. At the time, arcade machines were technologically at the top of the food chain. You can, if you had a Nintendo at home, it's fine, but it just didn't match that power. But what ultimately ended up happening is, the CD-ROM became a new medium that allowed for huge storage, much more powerful systems were starting to be developed, such as the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. And that comes in, and basically people start realizing that, wow, these systems at home are just as powerful as what we're getting in the arcade, and I can just buy a game for $40, $50 and never have to pay again. And I'm paying, and it's like 30 to 40 hours of gameplay, I'm in. So as a consumer, it just made sense. And so arcades really had a hard time trying to keep up with that, and arcades as we knew it at that time started disappearing because just because of the economics.
Because what I remember is people would have stacks of quarters like that and just put them on top of the game and just keep playing.
Yeah, and their parents can't do laundry because the quarters are all missing.
Exactly, right? Exactly. I think we've got this will take us to what I think will be our last clip, but I think it quite eloquently and very succinctly kind of gets to the economics of it all. And it's about a game called, that I don't remember or wasn't familiar with. What was it? Not Generation X. What was it?
Oh, Revolution X.
Revolution X. Yes. So let's watch that clip, and then we'll come back and discuss Insert Coin some more with Josh Tsui. So, besides, you talk a lot about the business model and the economics of it all. I mean, for a company like Williams Midway, how did that business model work? In that, did they actually sell the games, the consoles, and then the arcade would keep all the quarters? So it was all about. Is that how it worked?
It was a very strange business model, and this is something that a lot of people didn't realize, is that what happens in general is, Williams / Midway would create the software for the games and the hardware, which is the arcade cabinet. So you have these giant arcade cabinets, and they sold anywhere from between $4,000 to $5,000 for an arcade unit. And so what would happen though is that they don't sell directly to the arcades themselves. What they do is they sell them to a distributor. So the distributor buys it from Midway, and then the distributors from there then sells it to an operator, and the operator have basically territories that they send their machines to, and they go, and those territories have arcades, and so then you have the arcade owners. So there's multiple levels going on, and so what happens is that when the arcades are placed, when the machines are placed in an arcade, the arcade owners, they're not necessarily buying the machine. They're basically allowing them to put the machines into their space, and they split the revenue of the machine. Yeah. And so it's very interesting because I knew the dynamics of this, but when I got really deep in the documentary and figured out this whole business model, it was kind of mind-boggling at the time. So a good example is if Mortal Kombat cost, if they sold it for $4,000, they sold over 50,000 units of them. Now, when I talk to some video game people, their mind is, oh, you're selling a disc of games, and they're thinking, oh, a game on disc is like $50, and you only sell 50,000 units of this game. So no, you got to remember, we sold 50,000 units of a game that cost $4,000 each, and so you multiply that, and it's insane. And our budgets were super low, so the profit margins were nuts.
Yeah, I mean, I think you again, it's you just reminded me. There's a point in the film too, towards the end, I think, where they talk about how some of these people were or were not compensated in terms of the work they did or how much they were compensated. I mean, I found it extremely riveting, and I'm not even really wasn't a big video gamer. I just don't have the eye-hand coordination for that. But my limit was Battlezone back in the 80s.
Oh,
but,
that's a good game.
Yeah,
I think that's like the first VR game that was ever made. If you really think
that's what I looked that up today. I had no idea, but that's why I liked it or something. But it was at our local Pizza Hut. That was the only place that had it. And whenever we'd go out for pizza, I would be on there, and that's my stack of quarters. Didn't last very long, I can tell you. But I mean, what is this? Like all great documentaries, obviously it's about Williams and Midway and these incredibly, these dynamic people who design the games. But from what do you think? What is this film really about?
It's about quite a few different things, but for me, ultimately, it's about how design and commerce comes together to create the entertainment that we grew up with. A lot of people, when they see entertainment, they don't understand that sometimes it's designed with the business side in mind. And so that's why the film really concentrates on so much on the business side of things, because those games were designed that way for a reason, which is to suck in the quarters. It wasn't designed to tell a grand story for 5 hours long that that you could sit there and watch forever, that you can watch in one sitting. So because of that, some of the games are super fun because of that style of design, while other games were not super fun because of it. And it just, a lot of it came down to just how people, can really lean into this type of business model.
And there was also, these guys had, no offense, but for a bunch of geeky guys, I mean, it's like they had some insights into human nature and psychology. I mean, it was interesting. Some even comments about depending on the type of person you were killed by in a game would determine whether you would want to put your quarter in or not, Yeah,
and that goes back to what I was talking about with Eugene Jarvis. He affected the entire team because he literally is a genius. I can't even begin to describe how incredibly smart he is, and not just academically, but just on an emotional level. He really was just very insightful on how people behave. And so his comment about like, hey, I know that people are not gonna want to die in a video game by some small little person. If you get killed, you want to get killed by the biggest badass thing out there.
I think that's a quote. Yeah.
And so it's just, and so that type of, and that permeated through all of Midway's game design, at least on the most successful game, was that acting on those emotions, acting on those instincts, and not so much writing a script, trying to analyze everything ahead of time. A lot of it was really just like this gut feeling, but these guys made so many games that they knew what the recipe was, just like the back of their hand.
Yeah, I mean, you touch on, so as you say, you touch on the business side. One thing you also touch on, it's got a business element as well, but it's also the dynamics of teams. I thought was well done because I know from my own experience in the business world. I mean, the best teams I've ever been a part of were the ones that had a bit of tension to them. And there seemed to be a decent amount of tension there.
Yeah.
It's a fine balance. Obviously, they can become dysfunctional if there's too much. But it seemed like even the guy who was the CEO had an interesting view of management. But it was all about creating this competition between everyone.
Yeah, and Neil Nicastro, who the CEO, I mean, he came from New York. He had a very New York attitude about things, and so he comes to Chicago, to the Midwest, which has a very different personality, and he is just as influential on the design of the games as anybody, because not that he designed the games, but he designed the way the teams interacted, and it was all about conflict and challenging each other and competition. And it wasn't in a mean way. It was in a very informal way, but he wanted everyone to fend for themselves. So it's kind of like, it was like Lord of the Flies, basically. Yeah. And so with arcade games, at least in the early days, it worked very well, and everybody was very cooperative with each other. If somebody needed help, everyone was more than happy to help and give feedback and everything else. But there was also that layer of, like, I need to make sure that I'm making more money than this person. It was a constant contest. I need to make sure I'm selling more units. And a lot of it, again, is from this New York sales attitude that was kind of infused throughout the company. And so it worked great in the arcade days when games are small. Our teams were really small. There were maybe 4 or 5 people or so. Later on, as the game industry got bigger, and I talked about these CD-ROM games, like the PlayStation games that had much larger scope, that type of management would start to fall apart. You can't do that when you're dealing now with 50 to 100 people, and so it was great for that era, but yeah, it didn't last long after that.
It was sort of survival of the fittest school of management. But I think I want to talk about your insights. I think are very interesting because you went to you originally went to film school. You were going to go do film, but how did you get into video games?
I originally went to film school. I thought I was going to graduate, move back to California, and get into the film industry. And in my last year in film school in Chicago, I got really into computer graphics, and that computer graphics were just starting to come around at that point. And so one of the things that I was really interested in was combining my film video knowledge into the computer, digitizing video, manipulating it, and having all kinds of fun with it. And this is before Photoshop or even After Effects or any of those programs. Yeah. I would do it manually. And at that point, Midway had just released the first Mortal Kombat, and had huge success, and they were looking to really just get into the whole idea of using video for all their games. And so they were looking for people that had this type of knowledge. Up until then, most of their artists were really, they're great illustrators, more comic book artists, but they needed more people who knew video. And so a friend of mine was working on a game there, and he called me in. I went and interviewed. I ended up interviewing 9 times over the course of a year before I got hired. And then I got hired, and I thought I would be there for maybe a year or 2, and then go back to filmmaking. And 25 years later, I was still stuck making video games.
Well, so you say stuck, but I mean, this is not that uncommon these days, is it now? I mean, this is what the business has become. I know in this country, video games are bigger than the film industry now.
Yeah, it's amazing. The technology. The video game technology has just grown so much. It's leaps and bounds, and now it's getting, that technology is starting to enter the film industry. And so I feel very lucky that I've been able to keep up with the technology. And so, like, one show such as Disney's Mandalorian, they're using a game engine for their backdrops and everything. And for us, that's like that's stuff we've been working on for years. It's really fun. It's really fun to see that all coming together. And so for me personally, it's nice to see that, and I still straddle the video game / film world back and forth. So it's been very fulfilling.
And so where did you? You've been. As you say, you've worked on Mortal Kombat, Fight Night, Tony Hawk, or some of the other games you've worked on. What made you decide, wait a minute, I want to get back to filmmaking, and this is the film I want to make? Because is this your debut?
Yeah, this is my debut, and I chalk it up to having a midlife crisis, a while back ago.
Yeah.
And I had always known that I wanted to eventually make at least one film in my life. I just felt like it was just I had gone to school for it and I never got to do it. And so, when I started getting the itch to do that, one of the things that I had learned from somebody, I don't remember who it was, but they basically said, for your first time film, whether it's documentary or whatever it's going to be, make it about something it's a low hanging fruit, and so that way you're learning the technical chops, you're learning about story, telling things, and you're not spending so much time trying to discover the story. And so I thought that was great advice. And I was profiled on this website called Polygon. They did a profile about my career in video games, and after that article, I started thinking to myself, I was talking about Midway Games, and I had worked at Midway Games during the 90s, during the era that the film was about. And I thought, people know the games and they know some information, but nobody's ever really did a holistic view of that entire era. And I felt like I was kind of uniquely positioned to do that. And it was getting to a point where, it's 20 years later and people are starting to get nostalgic for it. And so I thought the timing was right to do that. And I figured if I don't do it, somebody else is going to do it. So I just kind of, grabbed for the brass ring and just go for it.
I think, except for the coronavirus, I think your timing's perfect because you've got the 90s are hot. We've got Last Dance, so Chicago's hot in that way. You've got NBA Jam, NBA's hot again. It never was not hot, I guess. So I think you're there. We had there's people may not know there's going to be a Baywatch documentary made, and we had them on.
I heard about that.
Yes, so that we've had them on, and this I was just not aware that because that's the type of person I am, but not aware of how hot the 90s are at the moment. But seems to me this captures it, at least the way I remember it. It captures it.
That's great to hear.
Well.
That's great to hear.
What was the receptiveness to this project? Because there you are. Here's Josh showing up saying, "Hey guys, I want to interview you. You used to work with me, and I know some of you may not even talk to each other anymore." How was that?
You know what? Everybody was so happy that somebody was doing this. Almost everybody said, I can't believe nobody has done this yet, and they were really happy that somebody they knew was doing it. And so. Yeah, it was just great to talk to everybody again and hear their sides of the story. So it was interesting because I went in pretty much knowing what the story was, but once I started talking to people, it became a little bit of kind of like a Rashomon situation where you had the same story from different points of views.
Right.
So that was really fun to hear. And originally, I didn't think I was going to do much in regards to the business side of things. I had only talked to the developers because that's who I was comfortable with. But as time went along, I started really getting interested in the business end of things because it was kind of territory for me. And I felt that really made the documentary. And I was very lucky to get the CEO of the company. He remembered me. And so, but at the time I was just some punk kid. And so, but I was very grateful for him to do this interview because he's never been interviewed ever about any of this stuff. And so, so for him to sit down with me for a few hours to go over things was just amazing. So yeah, it was almost like a family reunion in many ways.
Gosh, it sounds like a lot of fun. How I think you definitely get a flavor for what it was like working there. Is that pretty? That's the way it was in the 90s. Is that the way it is in this industry? It seems pretty gung
It's
ho.
scrappy, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it depends. Yeah, there are many. I mean, back then it was very scrappy, and Midway was a big company, and they kept it scrappy. Yeah. Nowadays, the game industry is much more professional and much larger, though, in nature. So if you go to an EA or a Microsoft or an Activision, it's not going to be that scrappy. But there are still a lot of game developers that are like this. Most of them are indie game developers. And I always say that Midway, the way we were managed, the way we made games, we were the most well-funded indie video game team out there. Because they left us alone. We did whatever we wanted to do. All they cared about was just be on time and on budget, and just tell us what the game is. When you're done with it. And so that's the way the indie game development is. But in terms of large studios, it's not like that anymore. Which may or may not be a bad thing. Games are a little bit less scrappy than they used to be.
Well, exactly. But I think that is an interesting point. I think it struck me, it's almost like what you sometimes hear, whether it's true or not, about Google and letting guys just go off and do whatever they want. I don't think that actually really happens, but no, it was quite, and then the competition between everyone, I think it was very interesting. One thing in watching this that struck me is that there is a person missing in it. I even looked him up to make sure he hadn't died. And that's, did you try to get Ed Boon in on this project?
Yeah, I know Ed really well. We've met up more than a few times, and I was trying to get him on there, and it just can't get worked out. A lot of it has to do with he still works on Mortal Kombat. That IP is now owned by Warner Brothers, and there are just certain sensitivities to it. So I wanted to be very respectful to him, and made sure that he was in the film, and we talked about him extensively. But it was just one of those things that we couldn't work out. But ultimately, there's a lot of Mortal Kombat in there, but ultimately it's really about the entire output of that team, and so it's definitely a miss, though.
Yeah, no, but I think you still get you have some interesting. I won't give it away, but there's some interesting points people make about how especially how Mortal Kombat sort of reflects Ed Boon's personality. But maybe we'll leave it at that. So we've been talking about we'll continue talking about this great film you've made, but the project. I mean, now we've got you're supposed to do the debut South by Southwest. Coronavirus has happened. I mean, how are you making the best of a difficult situation from that standpoint?
Yeah, I think like many filmmakers that are that we're supposed to be at South by and so on. A lot of it is we're kind of figuring it out as we go along, because there's still a lot of value in the film festivals and just getting the word out and getting that excitement. But now being online, it makes it's a little different. So everyone is still kind of figuring that out. My thing is that I want to take I've worked on the film for a long time, and I don't want to rush it out and just and start panicking and just get it out there. So we're still going to go through these various film festivals just to get the word out. Working with Cargo, releasing in films out in New York City, and they're working on the plans for various distribution for the film itself. And so haven't gotten everything nailed down yet, but we're kind of marching our way towards it. And hopefully it'll be out very soon. That's the only thing I can say at this point.
Well, I hope so too, because I mean I'm probably one of the few people, certainly this side of the pond, that's had a chance to see it. But I do hope people do get a chance to see it. I really enjoyed it. I think, I mean, back to this thing with festivals. I mean, for many of our listeners, I know that one of the points, well, besides festivals, seeing networking and things, that festivals have played this really important part in terms of helping independent filmmakers get distribution. Now that everything's gone online, is that completely gone? There's that element is gone from these festivals, isn't it?
I mean, it's it remains to be seen how much of an impact impact change it's going to be. But it's one of those things where there's also there's also the prestige of the festivals themselves getting accepted, and it's a nice stamp of approval for the film itself. So even if the presence of like even if the sales presence is different from it, when I look at the long tail of things, having the stamp of approval from those festivals will help the film in the long run, because it differentiate the film from from other films. Obviously, like for me, for Insert Coin, there's it's about video games, and there's a ton of stuff about video games out on YouTube and other other channels and such, and they're all really great. But for me, having gone through this current process, it's something I wanted to do, because I wanted to differentiate my film from from that, and not saying that one is better than the other, but I wanted to really just go the traditional documentary route with this subject matter, and so that's why I'm kind of sticking with with what we're doing right now.
Well, and I think the thing is there's no wrong or right answer, because no one really knows what's. I mean, I know some who aren't doing festivals, some who still are, such as yourself. I know. Did you take part in that? South by tried to put everything on Amazon, didn't they? But a decent number of the documentary filmmakers didn't go on along with that.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I definitely appreciated what they were doing with that and stuff. I mean, what an amazing opportunity to get your film out into so many people. I think the thing that kind of held us back just a little bit on that was it was still very early on in those days. We're still reeling from the fact that South by got canceled, and so when this was put together, there were just a lot of unanswered questions about it. So it wasn't that it wasn't like a positive or a negative thing. It was just like, well, we don't know what the long-term impact of this may be, because you're putting your film out to hundreds of millions of people. How does it does it change the dynamics for sales of the film later on? And nobody knew the answer, so we just wanted to be a little cautious about that.
And I think the thing is, we still don't know the answer, do we?
We still
I mean, that's where we are.
Yeah.
So Josh, I mean, what's next? So you've done the like they tell authors, like they tell filmmakers, your first project should be something you're passionate about, or no. What's next for you? That's
a really good question. I have,
I'm sure your family wants to know too.
Yeah, they want to know. Yeah, they're like, can you get out of the house? It's like,
exactly.
Go do something. No, there are 3 or 4 different projects that I'm kind of looking at. They're mostly all pop culture based, because I really like pop culture a lot. And one of them, and I don't mean to be coy about them, just because I'm still trying to figure this out, but one of them is video game related, but the others are not. One concern I have is this is my first film, and making about video games has been great. I don't know if I want to do a second film about video games, because then suddenly I become the video game documentary guy.
Exactly.
Nothing wrong with that, but I was like, there might be some other things I want to do that might be harder to do later on if I were to do that. But I love I love music, video games, comic books, and skateboarding. So something and Chicago. So something hovering around those things, and so we'll see. Yeah, but I definitely I'm taking a long break from video games and really focusing on films and some other interactive projects.
So if we want to keep tabs on you and what you move to next, what's the best way of doing that?
Boy, I'm pretty active on Twitter, so it's Josh YTSUI, and that not necessarily saying that it's great content I'm putting out there, but just mindless drivel. But there's that, and then Insert Coin Doc is the other Twitter feed for the film itself. But those 2 accounts are probably the best way of keeping track of where I am.
Well, I wish you luck. I mean, if you do the same production value and editing and everything that you did with this one, I think you'll do. I'm sure you'll do quite well. So
thank you very much.
It was. I tell you, it was certainly. I mean, I was talking to Alex here, who was in the studio. I think my attention span's not what it used to be, but that first hour was just like it flew by, and I found myself just really like laughing and being entertained, and And I think it's very insightful into a world that's, and it's not just nostalgia. I think there's a lot that comes out of this besides just remembering how all that stuff we thought was so cutting edge maybe doesn't look quite so cutting edge anymore, you know. But yeah, so hey, well, unfortunately, I think that takes us to the end of our time, Josh. So I just want to thank you again for coming on to the podcast. It's been a joy having you. Just to remind our listeners that we've been speaking with Josh Tsui, the director, writer, and producer of Insert Coin. Also want to give a shout out to This Is Distorted here in Leeds, England, where we record the podcast. And please remember to like us and share us with your friends and family wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. This is Factual America, signing off. You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guests, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures. Be the first to hear about new productions, festivals showing our films, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.